Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to talk to you today about an important topic, accessibility, and how to plan and design for accessible experiences. My name is Fred Faulkner, and I'll be your moderator today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note that we will have all your lines muted during today's discussion. If you have any questions, please submit them in the questions box. We will gather those and answer as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. Don't worry if you miss anything. We are recording today's session and we'll plan on sharing the recording and artifacts with you via email afterwards. We appreciate if you can fill out our survey at the end of today to let us know how we did. Your feedback is very important to us. All right, if you're not familiar with us, ICF Next is a consulting agency where we believe that participation is greater than experience. In a world where everyone expects great experiences, we work with brands and organizations to connect with their community, be it their customers, their colleagues, or citizens, to create active participation. Participation is earned, it's reciprocal, it's shared, it's relevant, it's inclusive, and when done right, delivers meaningful outcomes. We combine the creativity of an agency with the depth and expertise of a consultancy. Our global team of 1,700 changemakers are a mix of mission-driven strategists, designers, marketers, technologists, and data scientists, harnessing the insights, creativity, and technology that move people. That's what we call accelerated change, beautifully delivered. It's my pleasure today to introduce our presenters. Catherine Feeney is a partner, client engagement at ICF Next. AC has over 17 years of agency experience driving growth through digital and brand experiences for industries such as healthcare, CPG, and fast casual dining. AC has focused on digital transformation from strategy to implementations, integrated communications, innovation, and technology. AC has been at ICF Next for over 2 years and leads one of our most strategic healthcare accounts. Jane Motz is a partner, strategy, experience design at ICF Next. Jane has 15+ years of experience in design, content strategy, user experience, and information architecture. Jane has created products for multiple industries and has produced award-winning content for leading brands in finance, media, automotive, fitness, and healthcare. Jane has been with ICF Next just under a year and leads a team of strategists, data scientists, and UX and UI designers to create high business value, world-class digital experiences. AC and Jane, thank you very much for being with us today. Jane, why don't you share with the audience what you plan on covering today?
Great, thanks, Fred. So today's takeaways are simple, and we've numbered them here. And after this session, you will know how to plan for accessibility and more specifically, a compliant website by understanding accessibility or A11Y, a little bit more about that later, navigating the guidelines, designing content, developing and testing, and finally, planning for success. So in our opinion, great experiences require accessibility. And at ICF Next, we work to bring human-centered, experience-led capabilities to every stakeholder engagement. And we know that no one designs a website to intentionally leave people out. It usually goes against what most organizations stand for, to be inclusive and provide their customers and their stakeholders with meaningful experience. But we believe that these goals are met when all users are considered. And our view is that delivering great experience begins with accessibility. Through experience-led transformation, all stakeholders achieve active participation. But how can we ensure great experiences drive towards participation? Well, it's where participation is where expertise meets expectation. Designing for accessibility has us go through what users want and need to be successful when using our websites. The common heuristics that are at the very core of usability practices are the very same that ensure that we're designing for an inclusive internet. And if organizations have these goals and wants for their product, we know that they can be met with accessible design methods. So it's our belief that brands that are differentiated will go beyond experience design to experience-driven transformation. And tactically, this will take shape through usability, accessibility, designing for loyalty, and creating advocacy. So who benefits from website accessibility? Well, in our belief, a lot of people do. It's a really big tent. And it's never the case that companies want to leave people out. But it may be the case that some people fail to see the risks associated with non-compliance, legal fees, brand reputational harm, lost revenue from abandoned shopping carts, or even losing out to a customer to a customer who's offering a superior user experience. And we know that according to the Centers of Disease Control, about 25% of US adults, or approximately 61 million people, identify as having visual impairment, blindness, shade blind, low vision. They use mobile limitations for reliance on mobile support. They may have cognitive disabilities, hearing challenges, deafness, partial deafness, or have epilepsy or seizures. And one interesting thing about this is that barrier-free accessible designs that take these focus areas into account also benefit senior citizens and the elderly. Digital products often fail this growing and wealthy demographic, and current interaction designs often feature illegible text, tiny targets, startling sounds, and other features that make the online world unfriendly to older adults. So, how can we do better by making responsible for making products that are universally accessible? Well, a good place for us to start is by examining the problem space and understanding accessibility. So accessibility is a big tent of considerations of many product types for many user groups. And for this presentation, we're going to focus on web accessibility as it relates to human-centered design that benefits all people of all abilities. So you might be asking yourself, what is a web accessibility? Well, sometimes you see it described as A11Y. And A11Y is the abbreviated term. It stands for, as you can see here, the 11 characters between the first level of accessibility and the last letter. And if you look at it, it looks like the word ally. And when we build an accessible, inclusive internet and website for our customers, we are being a good ally to everybody who is using them. So generally, accessibility is about making your product and service available for everybody, regardless of their ability. But we also consider it an aspect of usability that defines a way a person can use a website to achieve their goal. And this can be any person and any goal. And it's also the practice of making a website usable for as many types of users as possible by paying attention, close attention, to the groups in the focus areas of disability. And I've already mentioned visual, motor, and auditory areas, but we also pay attention to cognitive or learning, social inequality, and cultural differences, all areas that are equally important, and that list is not exhaustive. So if we look at web accessibility over time, many companies have learned about accessibility the hard way through lawsuits, reputational damage, and investments in rework. And so companies like Winn-Dixie, Beyonce Inc., TD Ameritrade, Netflix, Domino's, Target, many other websites have been subject to lawsuits for their lack of accessibility according to the American Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And we know that there's potentially more to come. And this is partly because of the complexity of the accessibility space, both compliance-based and non-compliance-based industries. They often lack the understanding around the ADA itself and what it means for their business. And you can see on this timeline that the ADA came of age about the same time the internet did, in the 90s. And by 1999, the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, had developed a series of guidelines to really assist developers and designers in creating digital products like websites and mobile apps, and making it easier for people with disabilities to use and operate. And this set of website content accessibility guidelines, sometimes shortened as WCAG or WCAG, continued to evolve over the decades and became an ISO worldwide standard. And WCAG is often being involved constantly by software developers, accessibility experts, product designers around the world, and it's currently in its version 2.1. There are levels within the guidelines that have specific requirements. You'll often see them demonstrated as A, AA, AAA. So without delving too deeply into these, for the purposes of this presentation, most companies want to be at 2.1. And the main difference between 2.0 and 2.1 is mobile. Companies have been getting into trouble for not having accessible mobile, and so the WCAG released a 2.1. In the United States, the ADA Title 3, Section 508 is often shortened to Section 508, is often named when talking about accommodations for people with disabilities on the web. And some US states are ahead of others when it comes to applying standards. Some use WCAG, some use 508. But the important thing is that despite the evidence of positive effects on revenue generating areas for the business, that come from accessibility, some may only view it and the investment in accessibility as a development or a compliance cost. But it doesn't change the fact that this still, in many jurisdictions, including United States, Canada, and Europe, this is a legal requirement. So how do we think about the business case for accessibility? You're of course going to want to consider the risks and the benefits from the outset. And categorically, the risks and benefits of accessible websites are here. I mentioned the threat of lawsuits and settlement costs. Compliance costs down the road and remediation can be very expensive. And you also run the risk of your roadmap being unprotected as you focus on compliance or remediation and have to abandon key aspects of your roadmap. There's the brand reputation as it reflects poorly on your corporate social responsibility, and also lost and untapped revenue by ignoring key groups, like seniors, like I mentioned before. The benefits, however, are vast. You can improve your customer engagement, your usability, and your overall satisfaction score. You can reach a broader audience because you're differentiating your brand through superior user experience. Designing for the disabled, as I mentioned, is also similar to designing for seniors for a broader market. And it's our belief that beautiful and usable websites attract more traffic and also have an improved SEO benefit.
Yeah, this is a great list to look at it, Jane, especially through the business case lens. And I think another thing that ICF frequently does when we're looking at these types of problems and solutions is to look at how companies can go from to and evaluate their current state of their web experiences and what that future state should look like and where they want to push that to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And oftentimes we think about people's ability to tackle those higher order accessibility items as part of a digital maturity model, but I'll talk more about that after. So now I just want to delve a little bit into navigating guidelines. So creating accessible websites can be confusing if you don't know the guidelines. And I'm going to say, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't delved into the guidelines, they can be confusing. Even in the simplest of spots, it's hard to know where to look. So here's how to find your way and plan your project right. So some of the key questions you're going to ask yourself on the outset include how many countries. So websites need to provide effective communication, and the WCAG is the way to measure. And so the common practice is to use WCAG, as I mentioned, 2.1 AA guidelines, but different countries have different requirements. So it's important to check your local and state laws. You don't want to overdevelop, but you definitely don't want to underdevelop. And so you also need to take a look at which platforms. So for instance, do you need to develop guidelines for mobile, or are you just looking at a desktop product? And then also you want to pay attention to how many types of assistive technologies are you targeting? Are you in a position where you can make a website that looks some way for sighted people and some way for non-sighted or partly sighted people? So these are things that you have to take into consideration, and all of this can be wrapped up in knowing your user. So a good approach is to secure buy-in first from everybody, all the stakeholders that you are working with. You'll be more successful by establishing the right level of urgency and priority and unlocking the right amount of budget if every stakeholder that you're working with, be it your client, your internal, your customer, are aligned and engaged in the process. And knowing and understanding your full audience, researching their needs, performing a proper discovery. These are good UX practices, but they're also going to be great for accessibility. Defining the success of your project will help you stay on track. And I can't say enough, test early, test often to avoid wasting time and rework. So let's take a look at design. So beautiful and usable design are not mutually exclusive, and there's no trade-off between the two if the users are at the center of your design. And when you're designing for users in mind, it means that you're focusing on providing an experience that does not do things like over-rely on only color, sound, interaction, or flash, things that move, or overly technical copy. And so when you're looking at beginning design, Some of these things will be repetitive, but you'll see why it's important. Again, you want to invoke what level of criteria do you need to be at? Who is your audience? What level of functionality is needed? But I also would caution that design directors, creative directors, directors of UX also pay attention to how their staff is trained, and do they understand accessibility? And do they understand the brand style guidelines, and have they been tested for accessibility? You will risk a lot of rework and discord in your team if people don't understand what they're doing, the nature of the assignment, and whether or not the assets they may be getting from a creative agency or another company or another partner, if they're not accessible. So get everybody on the same page. So as I mentioned, the best approaches are to get that alignment about guidelines and level of knowledge, check those brand guidelines. There's tons and tons of color palette builders that designers can use online. They plug into common design tools like Sketch. So there's no excuses for not building out an accessible color palette. There's so much help online. Make sure that you have checkers installed and that things are also being analyzed by experts. It's great for your design team to have a base level of knowledge and be able to check their own work, but again, they're going to be relying also upon experts in your organization to also help guide them. With respect to design pattern libraries and component libraries that developers use, they should all be tested for accessibility. And then test solutions with wider selections of users. It's common knowledge that everybody has an unconscious bias. Designers are not exempt, so please check each other's work, socialize your documents, and this comes from every aspect of design: the copy, the color, the image selection, the photography, the way interactions are positioned. Some of it can be can lack inclusion for people with cognitive impairments or learning disabilities. So it's really, really important to check everything, especially when it comes to copywriting.
These are great points, Jane. One thing that stuck out to me, I think when we think about accessibility, we so often think of the visual aesthetics that come along with that. Can you tell a little bit more about what type of copywriting training one would need to have to write to accessibility in mind, or leverage tools in the right way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for us on our staff, we have UX writers, and we also have copywriters. So copywriters will be paying attention to the level of language, like not using jargon, making sure that the general population can know and understand the copy that's being written. UX writing is also part of the mix. It's a different skill set. So that would be writing prompts, for instance, that are understandable and describe what the user should expect after they use the prompt. So not just having read more, have something that describes what's happened when they click the button. And then there's other things like providing informative, unique page titles, and using headings and subheadings to convey the structure of what's in the document. Having transcripts for closed captions and having it translated into more than one language, if that's commonplace in your country of origin. Providing clear instructions that don't use acronyms or internal facing language. ACU and I both worked on a lot of different corporate websites, and you always have to make sure that the company understands that their internal language is not their external facing language, so they can't use their corporate speak. And then keeping content clear and concise, but also not over relying on color and being sensitive, culturally sensitive to color.
Great.
So let's talk a little bit about development and testing. So when you bring all of your efforts into realization using the proper code and testing, it's really important, again, to test early and often. And because you want to have your final product withstand compliance audits, but also meet the user needs. So what do we consider? For developers and testers, the upfront key questions are largely the same as designers, but there's some nuance in how you'll be using code and tools. But we always begin with assessing the necessary level of compliance, the known issues, and level of prioritization. And I also want to point out here that developers should be part of discovery activities that happen before we start. Developers are user too, and so they often have a lot of valuable input that they can bring into the strategy and design team. And it's really, really helpful to have the whole team on the same page. With respect to approach, again, ensure the team is aware of accessibility guidelines and is up to date on their knowledge about global coding practices and standards, and even have them maybe participate in some user testing upfront before they begin their work. And that's user testing on designs so that they can really empathize with the end user. Collaborate early with the design team, allow people to have input, and provide setup and installation of testing software in a self-contained environment. I'm told virtual machines are the best so that it doesn't interfere with the main one that they're using to code. And test and implement accessibility and remediation as soon as possible, and then go and test again. Again, this sounds repetitive, AC, but it's really, really important for people to understand that if they test early and often, they're going to save money down the road, and it's just better for themselves, their customers, and really everybody.
For sure. Great, thanks, Jane. So let's pivot gears a little bit and think about how to apply a lot of these great tips that Jane has just walked us through as it relates to planning for success. So if you're giving accessibility the attention that it truly deserves and carefully baking it into projects up the front, that can have huge payoffs in the end for both the agency, the client partner, but more importantly, the consumer. And it's really critical to always keep that end user in mind throughout this journey. So some key questions that you should be thinking about at the start of any project. First, it's always important to understand if we're talking about a net new experience, in which case you'd build with accessibility in mind, or if this is an existing property that you have to have the team go back in and offer up remediations to meet compliance standards. Another point is to truly understand who the SMEs are from all parties involved, be it agencies, clients, any other third parties that will have input on the process. So this could be people like designers, brand stewards, technologists, some organizations even have in-house accessibility experts. And all of these groups should be consulted at different stages throughout the process, and they might have varying degrees of influence over your project as well. In other times, these folks also might even input on the validation process. So it's just important to understand the mix of roles and responsibilities that all contributing parties will bring to the table. Next, it's important to think through how any added complexities with design, development, and testing could impact your budgets and timelines. So if you have more resources or longer sprints where you need to be addressing any types of remediations or extra focus on accessibility, all of those things will obviously have an impact into your proposal. And last, try to have a bigger understanding on the impact that accessibility can have. So what are those both near and long-term goals that can be helpful returns to your client or organization, and that can help us lead into the approach that we would take with this as well. So you should always start by having clear understanding of goals and compliance requirements, and this will help remove some of the guesswork and really help you build your project schedule and estimates and everything according to those specifics. There's really no exceptions. Nowadays, you have to account for accessibility as part of an original project plan and budget. And it should really become table stakes for any type of digital experience. So make sure you're thinking through the impacts that will have from budget and timing. I just mentioned roles and responsibilities for SMEs. So once you've identified them, put them to work. I think it's really important not just to tap into them at the start of a project. They should be involved early and often throughout this whole process to make sure that your team is looking at designs, the development and code, testing, and also how you're optimizing with accessibility in mind at every single stage. And then the last thing I would say from an approach is just make sure you're having conversations around acceptance criteria. So expectations are the same and that you just have a shared view of what success looks like. And that can be sharing different tools or processes or when and where you're testing throughout the project. But the whole purpose of having that added communication is so that you're lessening the chance of subjectivity when you're going through those reviews. So two different success examples that I want to share with you now. These are both accessible web experiences, but the process of how we got there were quite different, including the planning. So the first one I want to mention is the California State Lottery. So a couple years ago, the state of California put out a mandate that all state web properties had to be compliant following WCAG 2.0 guidelines by 2019. And since the lottery is state property, that was no exception to that. So ICF Next evaluated the current state of the site, and they really came to the conclusion that there were so many compliance issues that they all agreed to start a clean slate and move forward with a net new build on this, rather than going back through and trying to remediate and update designs and things like that. So ICF was tapped in to manage the full end-to-end experience, which include design, development, the QA, and testing and validation as well. And I think important to note is that design was really a huge part of this process, starting with the site map, and then everything else kind of followed in place, all having that accessibility first mindset. Our agency used an accessibility SME every step of the way. This included, you'd want to involve a SME to look at things like user stories, defining what those accessibility requirements are, getting input on wireframes and design comps, and then ultimately for that testing and validation as well, if that's how you are set up to work with the client, in which case California Lottery was. And then last year, the California Lottery launched a beautiful and fully compliant new experience on both desktop and mobile. So that kind of summarizes one path that you could take for a net new build. Another example is a Medicare education site in the healthcare space where we had the same outcome of success in market, but a very different process of getting there. So this was an existing property that had been around for quite a while. And as accessibility became more and more in the spotlight, we knew that it had to be, rather than go back in and rebuild the site ground up, we determined that remediations would be a viable solution. So another aspect of this project that brought a little bit of a unique way of working to this group is that this particular client has in-house team of accessibility experts. So there was an understanding that we had to collaborate with them throughout the process. So this group ran initial audits and scans to help us identify where there were gaps in compliance. Then ICF Next worked on what those solutions were, factoring in the level of effort, the timing and budgets and budgets that it was going to take in order to implement those remediations. And once we had alignment on what those fixes were, we prioritized them and started introducing solutions by tapping into designers, developers, and SMEs along the way, and kept working and having releases that were updating and fixing a lot of the issues that had been flagged by the accessibility experts. We also faced another challenge last year where this particular web property was asked to introduce another new piece of technology on the site. So the site was already compliant. They had to bring on this new piece of technology, which was a chatbot. And so similar to our primary site experience, we had to design and build that chatbot, factoring in the latest WCAG 2.1 standards and working through that collaborative process that I just outlined as well. So the chatbot launched on top of the site experience last year and upheld that already inclusive mobile and desktop experiences. So again, just two different examples of how you can realize accessibility in market success. Jane, I'm going to pass it back over to you to summarize and bring this all together.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's bring it all together. So some of the best practices when navigating the guidelines I'll just go over the 6 that we have here. So with respect to country and state, know your state and national laws because each jurisdiction can be different. For industry, again, your industry or your category might have different levels of compliance, and different levels of the guidelines might apply to you over someone else. So it's important for you to be clear. Likewise, with technology, you also want to know which technologies or assistive technologies your audience will be using. And with respect to buy-in, you want to get early buy-in from stakeholders from right across your organization. Protect your work and make sure it's funded till the end. And lastly, reach out for help. There are lots of resources online, and we're going to provide some of them for you in a handout after this webinar. And there's lots of places for you to go, but also your legal department and other experts will be able to guide you if you have questions. For design, we really can't recommend enough that you know your brand and that you plan ahead. Check your brand colors, your photos, your images, your videos. Make sure that you have copy that is accessible. Be deliberate with your content writing, but also with your UX writing. Again, those links and prompts, etc. Have transcripts ready for captioning, and make sure that that level of language is also descriptive and understandable. As I've mentioned many times, check early. Check the designs at the earliest possible stage, the wireframe, the mid-fidelity. Look at color. Don't always use color. Check filters and text size. And build an accessible palette. No excuses on this one, designers. There's lots of tools available, so go out and find something that works with your Figma, your Sketch, or your Adobe XD. Test your libraries that you build out. Make sure things are within compliance, but make sure that you're always going back to diverse audiences while you're testing as well. And watch for your bias. Conscious or not, everyone's got a bias. So get feedback from other designers and other people in your organization. I like to run some of my work by AC once in a while, and she always gives me good feedback. For development, again, with respect to development and testing, we have a group of experts in-house that we're very fortunate to have. They're intimately familiar with the guidelines and the tools needed to validate compliance. So we lean on them a lot. And we also get them to educate the rest of us, which is helpful. Performing a site audit is for accessibility hotspots and to determine levels of compliance, be it Section 508 or WCAG 2.1. Make sure that you've got all of that, your arms wrapped around that. With respect to automated or manual analysis, so you're going to need to do a mixture of the two, okay? Like automated tools can take you so far, but for manual testing, that's going to help you with a whole range of things. Keyboard non-compliance, color contrast, again, the UX writing or the copywriting. And with respect to manual testing, we didn't go into it too deeply because we are trying to complete this webinar in an appropriate amount of time, but there's a whole body of research out there about testing on actual users from diverse groups. So designers, UX researchers, even developers and testers, keep that in mind when you are doing manual testing and usability testing. For a findings report, our team prepares an initial findings report, which is summarized and then shared with all the clients, along with the details of any accessibility and readability issues so that it's clear and everyone is on the same page. And finally, prioritization. So once we've issued that report, we can determine and prioritize what the fixes are and then put everything else into the backlog. Have someone like a product owner in your Agile Sprint or a BA in your waterfall organization own that backlog so that you always are moving towards a more accessible product with each new feature that you develop. AC, do you want to take these ones?
Sure, I can definitely do that. So when you're planning for best practices, just to kind of summary, make sure you're setting expectations and aligning on with all the clients or other key stakeholders before that estimation begins. So your project goals are clearly understood by all parties. Collaboration is going to be critical. So once those project goals are defined, work with your developers and designers and any other accessibility SMEs you have in your process to gauge the level of efforts, especially on remediations when you're working through those. Prioritize, so make sure you're working with your teams to align on what those most critical fixes are to introduce first, and then figure out what will follow in a backlog. And future planning, so sometimes clients are held to be having annual audits and scans, and just think ahead on what how you would be planning for those. And as you're going through enhancements on your web property, just making sure that you are considering accessibility throughout those phases as well. So a couple other things that we wanted to share with you are, if you're listening to this webinar, you may be thinking, okay, well, what can I do to champion accessibility in my own organization? And I think that there's a couple very simple things you can do. A lot of these don't even require funding. They just require participation and and encouragement from your own colleagues. So one of the first things you can do is educate your team. Hold lunch and learn style discussions, Q&As, things like this, where you might have someone come in, share a little bit about the experiences they've had. But it's a great way to start connecting to other people in your organization to know who those right resources are, and then you can leverage them when opportunities come about. Another idea is to start an accessibility community of practice. We started this at ICF Next. We actually have quite a few different communities of practice on different varying subjects. But the accessibility COP is a cross-discipline group of people who all simply have passion for accessibility. So whether they're doing it as the focus of their day-to-day job, or it's just something that they're interested in and want to learn more about, we come together and share experiences and best practices and just try to, all in the spirit of learning from each other.
Yeah, and I'll say here that I love our community of practice for accessibility. We really come from across the network on ICF, and everybody brings back what they learned to their team. So it's a great way of transferring knowledge, especially when you have our experts in there, helping with important initiatives like playbooks and educating us on when things change with respect to guidelines. It's super helpful, and it's great to be in such a progressive part of our company.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more. And Jane, you just mentioned an accessibility playbook. So I think it's another important thing for an agency or organization to define a process and work with the SMEs and business leads to put together an accessibility playbook. And I'm happy to report that ours will be coming out later this year. And then the last thing is simply to stay connected. I think that's more important now as we're all kind of adapting to virtual environments, to stay connected. So our organization has a lot of tools like Teams, Yammer, Slack, newsletters, blogs, where we can just actively participate in those types of tools and share and spotlight great work. And it's a very simple way to feel connected to everyone. As Jane mentioned earlier in the presentation, we did pull together a helpful list of resources. I'm not going to read through all of these, but we did bucket them out into planning and general information about accessibility, some that are better suited for design, and then others that are really focused in on development and testing. And all of these will be part of the Leave Behind that you can also download from the GoToWebinar chat window if you haven't done that already. And as Fred mentioned at the top of the call, we'll also be routing these in the next couple of days with the webinar recording.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, AC and Jane, for that great information. And I'm going to kick off some of the Q&A with us. We've been gathering a couple of questions along the way, so I'm going to start off with this one. And then again, if you have questions, please add them into the questions box on the GoToMeeting interface. We'll then get to them, but I'm going to have at least one to start off with here. So this goes like this. So who has a primary responsibility to produce accessible experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that one. Like, I would actually say that every member of the organization can influence, but there should be at least a few people, a good number of people aware of digital accessibility, just so that it's not always falling on designers or developers or PMs or content creators. Like management, executives, like everyone has a role to play. And so there's like some roles in a company that might be better prepared to have guiding conversations or to begin to build out accessibility testing guidelines or timelines rather. But really designers will create more usable designs from the beginning if they're aware of the concepts that we were talking about, like color contrast ratio or color palettes. And content creators will be more qualified in building compelling stories and leading towards experience-led transformation for everybody if they understand accessibility and have a plan for their infographics and their non-text content. And the list goes on. So like hopefully this demonstrates how a business can be more efficient and more compliant in some of these topics that we covered. But accessibility should be part of your culture. And, you know, as AC was mentioning, we have our community of practice at ICF Next. We really love being with our colleagues and championing accessibility together. And so if you make it part of your ethos, I do believe that everybody will shoulder the responsibility, but do it in a way that brings the team together and lifts up the quality. You know, there's a concept of digital maturity within companies, and companies with low maturity, you know, kind of look at accessibility as something that they have to do to prevent from being sued. But companies with a high level of maturity are already incorporating and optimizing for accessibility in a lot of their practices. They'll be, you know, using assistive technologies for testing purposes in-house perhaps, or, you know, they will be able to incorporate best practices and techniques into products that are net new, but ones that are actively being maintained, regardless if there has been remediation. So ideally, we want to work as a, you know, as a web development culture and community of practice, like the larger community of practice, all companies and all people who build for the web, to have a high level of maturity, but you can't get there overnight. So if everybody shoulders a bit of responsibility and puts it at the front of mind, I think that producing accessible experiences and having that return on accessibility will be something that will be really achievable for all companies.
Great. All right, another one that came in. Will refactoring, I don't know if this is maybe, let's make sure this makes sense. So will refactoring should take place after analyzing the screens required to be satisfied by W3A standards, or or we need to refactor entire existing systems? So I think as you're analyzing, then the question is basically, if you're trying to analyze what's going on and refactoring what needs to happen with screen size, does that meet the standards, or will an entire system have to be refactored within the existing system? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's kind of what I got here.
So, like, I mean, with respect to refactoring, like, I think it depends. Like, if the question is about screen size, then I think you are doing it one by one and not necessarily the whole system. I'm not entirely sure on the question. Maybe that's something that we can take away and come back with in a blog post.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so my client is not a government agency, or I'm not a government agency as well. So how does accessibility have to be as big of a focus?
I could probably take that one, Fred. So I would probably say that that's not really true. That it doesn't matter if you're a government, well, if you are a government agency, you probably have more mandatories to follow. But I would say any public-facing website or web experience should be built with accessibility experiences. The risk is, it's just too high these days, and there have been so many companies that, you know, groups have gone after, and the odds are typically in favor of inclusivity. So I wouldn't let, you know, being a public or private company like that determine if you follow accessibility or not. It's something that you should just be baking into your process overall.
And with all the benefits, like, why not? There's no need for you to not do it. And chances are, if you're a private company or you are not a government organization, you already have user experience designers on staff or usability analysts, and they will be telling you some of the very same things that your accessibility expert will. So you kind of get a 2-for-1 when you design for accessibility. Your UX team is going to be super happy.
Right. So another question that's come in. So what are some of the ways that companies can justify the ROA, or return on accessibility?
Yep, I can take that one. So you're going to want to look at the new markets you can hit. As I mentioned, seniors, the disabled community is also online, and they also have commerce to conduct and services and products to acquire online. So you can look at the new markets that you're hitting. You can look at the lowering of your spend on errors. For instance, accessibility, like good content writing, for instance, or UX writing for accessibility often shows a benefit in shopping cart abandonment. So you can also see those net benefits. And then you can juxtapose that against your risk for not meeting compliance and having remediation. So when you consider like the markets that you are to gain, the eyeballs, the traffic, the SEO, et cetera, and the cost that you're going to avoid, I mean, those are two very compelling lines of argumentation for you to bring to your business owners. AC, do you have more?
Yeah, I would also, those are all like spot on, Jane. I would also add that in the very beginning of this webinar, when you were talking about the CDC statistic that talked about like 25% of US adults having, falling into a one type of disability category or not. And if you just think about it from your audience base, like, if you're not designing to accessibility, you're immediately cutting out 25% of your potential customer base. So I think if you are able to invest and position this, that you can, you're creating a more inclusive experience for all of those people. That's just kind of an easy and more digestible business case of looking at it.
Right. Okay, we just answered one of the questions that came in. So then just kind of coincidentally went with that last topic. So my company doesn't have any true accessibility experts. Can we just use automated tools? And this is kind of also a nice follow on into that previous question about refactoring. And so the kind of don't have accessibility experts. So what do you do about that? Can we automate tools? The question that kind of came in was also, as a follow-on to that previous question that we might do as a blog post, was also how much can you automate and how much has to be manual when you look at applying accessibility to an existing site. So of experts, how much can automation happen? How much of it's really going to be manual? I'm going to kind of lump these two questions together from that perspective.
I mean, my perspective is that you shouldn't just rely on the tools, because you're really only going to cover about 25% of the issues. So automated tools are a good place to start. As I mentioned, there are a number of even checkers that designers can use at the beginning. But at the end of the project, if you're using automated tools, you're only going to capture so much. So you need to do manual testing. And so it's much safer for you as a business to combine the two together. So if you're concerned about your lack of expertise in-house, reach out. We can help you. There's plenty of information online. You can educate yourself and then come to us. This is like something that there's plenty of support out there. So there's really no reason for you not to at least try to have both.
Great. All right. So one of the next questions is, you mentioned kind of annual audits. So you talked about even doing things manually versus automating. So annual audits, what is the purpose of testing frequently if you've already got this built in to your site code? accessibility is kind of already built in. So what's the need to kind of do things on a regular basis to make sure that you are staying and maintaining that accessibility?
Yeah, I can take that, Fred. So I would say, you know, like when you're testing for accessibility, it's not just a one and done kind of task, especially if, you know, throughout the year, you are introducing new code, new features, functionality, any type of design updates. So anytime you're making adjustments like that to your site, you should be retesting for accessibility. So that would probably be the purpose for annual audits. And I think it's just, you know, it's good practice not to wait for those audits to happen. You should be building that into an ongoing process. So for any time you're releasing something new out into the public or as part of your experience, you should make sure that it's kept up with the standards and keep that going, you know, year over year, sprint over sprint.
Yeah, I mean, like just like any like testing at the end of a process, you don't want to wait for something to go wrong before you take a look at it. So make it part of your sprint process. We've had great success doing this at ICF Next with a bunch of our clients. And it's a good habit to get into. It's going to save you time and money and your customers time and money down the road.
Yeah, and another parallel you could draw is, you know, if you're doing usability study or any type of quantitative or even qualitative study with consumers, you wouldn't just test it once, you know, refine and put it in market. These are iterative things that you should constantly be testing for and making sure that you're putting out the optimal experience with your end user in mind.
Right, exactly. All right, well, I don't have any other questions in the queue. So AC and Jane, thank you again for all your insights today. I know everyone will be able to take away something from today, from a tip to apply to their own organization. Again, as a reminder, if you haven't downloaded the takeaway or the handout, please go into your GoToMeeting panel and grab that under the handout section. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to AC or Jane, or you can reach out to us at hello@icfnext.com. And thank you to all that attended today. This will conclude our webinar.